Russian writers were divided in the second half of the 19th century about how to understand Napoleon Bonaparte. On the one hand, Leo Tolstoy, in his magnum opus War and Peace, widely considered one of the greatest books ever written, was of the view that Bonaparte was a murderous brigand, a warlord bent on his own self-aggrandizement. He was scornful of the idea held by many in his own day that Napoleon was a great man, a figure who molded the history of his own times. Yet the direct opposite view was presented in Fyodor Dostoevsky's equally revered work, Crime and Punishment. Here, the protagonist, Raskolnikov, justified his own crimes as being necessary to achieve something greater in his life, to rise to the position of an individual such as Napoleon, one who changes the world, even if his methods are destructive. It's a curious contrast in depictions. Perhaps both of them captured something about Bonaparte, but that they could have such different views was perhaps because the destructive impact of Napoleon on Russia was still in living memory when the two men were writing in the 1860s. Just half a century earlier, Napoleon had launched an unprecedented invasion of the Russian Empire by a European power, one which led to the virtual destruction of the city of Moscow. It would be the defining campaign of Napoleon's long career of over 2 decades. The first wave of the French invasion involved 450,000 troops, commanded not just by Napoleon, but some of the other greatest generals of the day in Europe. Arrayed against these was a Russian army of approximately 200,000 men, commanded by Barclay de Tolly and Pyotr Bagration, 2 formidable commanders in their own right, but leaders of an army which did not have the fighting and strategic capabilities of La Grande Armée, the French military force which had vanquished all adversaries across Europe for so many years. The plan for Napoleon was simple: engage in a series of forced marches to proceed as speedily as possible to seize St. Petersburg and Moscow. Moscow, above all, was the prize. As such, it was something of a minor miracle that Napoleon managed to have his forces cross the extent of Russia, which they did in the course of July and August 1812. The most famous battle of the Russia campaign followed on the 7th of September 1812. The Battle of Borodino was the final major clash between La Grande Armée and the Russian army before the French moved on to Moscow. The Russians were commanded during it by Prince Mikhail Kutuzov, whom Tsar Alexander had replaced Barclay de Tolly with by that time. The clash was the bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon led just over 100,000 men onto the field of battle against upwards of 150,000 Russians. In the ensuing engagement, fierce close clashes were fought between the flanks and the main divisions. For a time, a swift surprise attack by divisions of Russian Cossacks threatened the French baggage trains and even Napoleon's own command center, but these were eventually repelled, and a final attack on the Russian redoubts won the day, and Kutuzov's forces broke. With victory at Borodino, the road to Moscow was open before Napoleon. No doubt he felt victory in the Russia campaign was within his grasp, but now Tsar Alexander and his government did something which Bonaparte did not expect. They began preparing to abandon Moscow entirely. The week that followed saw the French gradually advance into the suburbs of the city, with much of Napoleon's advance forces commanded by his brother-in-law, the King of Naples, Joachim Murat. Tsar Alexander and his government had not simply decided to abandon their capital and strip it of as many goods and supplies that the French could use as possible. They had also decided to torch their own ancient capital. The fires spread over the next day or two, even as Napoleon moved into the Kremlin, mockingly proclaiming of its defenses, "What a scary wall." But ultimately, the joke was on Napoleon. After witnessing much of the city engulfed in flames on the 15th, and marveling from the Kremlin at the fact that the Russians had done this to their own city, Napoleon was forced to leave the Kremlin as the fire risked spreading there, and instead established himself at the Petrov Palace outside the city and safe from the inferno raging within. As bad as the situation had been in September, in early October things took a drastic turn. The available resources in Moscow and the Muscovy region were now desperately thin. Then, the beautiful weather which Napoleon had written to his wife about became decidedly ugly. The first of the winter snows fell on Moscow on the 13th of October, 1812. By then, the French had been fanning out into the countryside around the city for some time in an effort to acquire food and provisions. But there they faced guerrilla warfare from peasants sabotaging their efforts and raids by bands of Cossacks engaging in hit-and-run attacks. With winter now upon the French, and Tsar Alexander refusing to even countenance peace negotiations, the possibility of marching on St. Petersburg to try to end the war by seizing the Russian capital was abandoned. It was in such dire circumstances that Napoleon gave the order for the French to begin preparing to retreat from Moscow. They began to leave the city on the 19th of October, 1812, but not before attempting to destroy what little remained of the city, notably lining much of the Kremlin with gunpowder, which was set alight as they pulled out, destroying several buildings, though leaving others largely unharmed. A week later, the Russians re-entered the city, which would take the better part of half a century to be rebuilt, and returned to its pre-invasion population. Meanwhile, Napoleon and his armies were desperately heading westwards towards the sanctuary of the Duchy of Warsaw. By mid-November, the Russian attacks on La Grande Armée, as it sought to snake westwards with inadequate winter clothing and little food, intensified. Aware that the baggage trains could barely be protected anymore, the Emperor ordered the destruction of his personal papers on the 20th of November to prevent his correspondence falling into Russian hands. Worse still followed, as over 25,000 men were lost, trying to cross the river Berezina, where the Russians made concerted efforts to delay their retreat. Thus it was that the bedraggled remains of La Grande Armée made it to Lithuania in December 1812, after one of the most disastrous invasions in military history. With the arrival to Vilna, now Vilnius, Napoleon engaged in what must have been one of the fastest treks across Europe in the pre-railway and pre-train age. So it was that shortly after midnight of the 18th, Napoleon reached Paris to prepare for the inevitable invasion which would come from Russia and those who would seek to take advantage of his weakened position. Napoleon's retreat from Russia and the disastrous outcome of the invasion saw the formation of a new alliance against the French. Napoleon's enemies finally saw their chance to strike while the emperor was wounded. In addition to the major powers of Russia, Britain, Prussia, Sweden, and Austria, Portuguese and Spanish rebels and a number of smaller states in Germany and Italy joined the coalition, while eventually even former stalwart allies of Bonaparte's, such as Bavaria, joined the war of the Sixth Coalition against France. The climax of the War of the Sixth Coalition occurred in Germany in the middle of October 1813. The Battle of Leipzig, or as it is also known in the German tradition, the Battle of the Nations, was the largest battle ever fought in Europe when it was pitched between the 16th and 19th of October. Despite the numerical disadvantage he was at, Napoleon believed he could aggressively attack the coalition forces and take advantage of the fact that their lines were spread out over a large geographical space. But Emperor Alexander and the other coalition rulers and commands countered by allowing the commanders of individual contingents of troops considerable freedom of action, instead of trying to direct the actions of over 250,000 men centrally. By the time the fighting finished, both sides had suffered between 60,000 and 75,000 casualties in terms of wounded and dead. But given the numerical superiority of the coalition armies by the autumn of 1813, the loss of this many men was a disaster for Napoleon, which all but ensured his defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition. By late March, the armies of Prussia, Russia, and Austria had advanced on the French capital and were nearing the suburbs. It fell to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother, to lead the last defense of the capital with some 30,000 men who were scrabbled together out of various remaining detachments of La Grande Armée and raw conscripts. However, they faced advanced coalition forces numbering approximately 150,000 men, or 5 times their number, with tens of thousands more advancing towards Paris in their rear. Faced with such insurmountable odds, Joseph eventually retreated out of Paris, even as Napoleon was advancing into the suburbs with some reinforcements. It was there that he learned that the city had surrendered on the 31st of March. A day later, Tsar Alexander addressed the Senate in the French capital and convinced them to depose the Emperor of the French. 2 days later, Napoleon was confronted by several of his most senior generals and marshals. The army, they informed him, would not fight any longer for him given the circumstances. On the 11th of April 1814, Napoleon met with diplomats representing the governments of Russia, Austria, and Prussia at Fontainebleau and formally abdicated. There they agreed the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Under the clauses involved in this, Napoleon confirmed his abdication and promised henceforth to renounce any future claims to France, while the claims of any member of the Bonaparte family to rule France were also prohibited. He also had to surrender his personal estates in France. But the most striking clause of the Treaty of Fontainebleau was that Napoleon was to become ruler of the small Italian island of Elba off the coast of Tuscany in Italy, where the Bonaparte family had originally hailed from centuries earlier. It is notable that when Napoleon was negotiating with the Russians, Prussians, and Austrians at Fontainebleau in April 1814, he had been offered a choice of whether he wished to rule over the island of Elba or Corfu as his island kingdom. He turned down Corfu, a significantly larger and more historic island. His reasoning, one imagines, is that with its location off the coast of northwestern Greece, Corfu was simply too far away from France. Whether he intended from the very beginning to escape at some point is unclear, but his hand might have been slightly forced by the arrival of news that deliberations were underway at the Congress of Vienna to change the circumstances of his retirement. The British, in particular, were pushing for more stringent punishment of the former emperor, and all of the coalition powers were resisting calls for additional funding to be sent to him, which had been a stipulation of the terms agreed on at Fontainebleau in April 1814. These developments, combined with news of unrest in France against the restored Bourbon monarchy, convinced Napoleon that he should leave Elba and roll the dice one last time against his enemies. Having consulted his mother, who had joined him on Elba, he quickly put together a small fleet of ships, and on the 26th of February 1815, with a small army and court of just over 1,000 followers, he set sail for the French Riviera with the goal of seizing power back in France and rebuilding his empire. After landing near Cannes and Antibes in southern France in early March, Bonaparte made his triumphant march on Paris and seized power there, with earlier turncoats such as Marshal Ney once again joining his cause, and King Louis fleeing the capital in the wake of Napoleon's arrival. In Vienna, the main coalition powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, issued a public condemnation of the former emperor, and each committed to bring 150,000 men into the field against Bonaparte. The result was the Waterloo campaign of mid-June in what is now Belgium. The battle, which would bring about Napoleon's downfall for the second time, took place at Waterloo in Belgium on the 18th of June, 1815. Bonaparte's plan for dealing with the armies of his enemies was to pick them off one by one early on, before they had a chance to coalesce and move in a concerted fashion towards Paris. To that end, he headed northeast from the French capital on the 12th of June, with the goal of striking at an army which Arthur Wellesley, the British hero of the Peninsular War, who had been ennobled as the Duke of Wellington, the previous year, was building up with British troops and Dutch and German allies in the Low Countries. These men numbered in the region of 25,000 British soldiers and 40,000 German and Dutch allies, but coming to support them was a force of 50,000 Prussians under Blücher. As Blücher's men began attacking the French flank, Napoleon had to commit his men to one final last-ditch assault on Waterloo. But this failed, and in the hour or so that followed, with more and more Prussian divisions arriving, the French were routed. By the time the battle ended, nearly half of Napoleon's forces had been killed, wounded, or captured. In the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon returned to Paris, arriving there on the 21st of June. In the retreat from Waterloo, over 10,000 of his men deserted, and it was clear he could not fight on. Despite this, he made some vague efforts at drumming up support in the capital for raising a new army. It met with complete disapproval. Instead, the Chamber of Deputies largely took power into its own hands and informed Napoleon that he would have to abdicate for the second time in a year. After seeing his mother for one last time in northern France in late June 1815, the great enemy of Britain for the last 20 years found himself in the unusual position of surrendering to the Royal Navy in the English Channel. He was quickly taken to southern England, where the man who was now referred to simply as General Bonaparte spent a few days on a ship in the harbour of the West Country town of Torquay, before being taken onwards to the port of Plymouth, where he was again not allowed to leave the ship. There, he discovered the grim fate that awaited him. The government in London had determined that Napoleon was to be exiled to one of the most remote corners of Britain's ever-growing empire. His destination was the island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, which is simultaneously 4,000 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro and 2,000 kilometers from Angola in southwestern Africa. Napoleon was quickly dispatched to his desolate new home. On the 7th of August 1815, 8 days after arriving in Plymouth, and without ever setting foot on English soil, he was transferred from the Bellerophon, the ship he had arrived on, to the Northumberland. 2 days later, the vessel departed on the 7,500-kilometer journey. Napoleon's final illness struck in early May 1821. By the afternoon of the 5th of May, it was clear that the end was nigh. He would pass away at 5:29 p.m. that evening. There were about 20 people present when he died. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of history's great figures, whether he is judged kindly or poorly. What all of this reveals is a man who rose from obscure beginnings to a position of immense power, based largely on his own abilities and, it is not unreasonable to say, his own greatness.